The child-free movement is something that has been on my mind quite a little bit, and my gut reaction, uh, or I suppose biblical reaction, is to be quite anti the child-free movement. I mean, the advocates of that movement, there are some frontline atheists and skeptics uh, that have spearheaded the thing in the media. And, you know, the Bible, of course, always describes children as a blessing from God, and the condition of being barren as a curse. And so those are the, those are the precepts that were in my mind when I started to think about it. But then thinking more deeply about it, and looking around a little bit more at various information that's available online, I suppose, and one is persuaded, I think, to think a little bit outside the box. It is true that children in biblical days were indeed a blessing because they brought wealth to the family. I mean, there was a traditionally based family, and where the children could work, they could help in the home, and um, I don't know. I suppose the daughters would be married off if they were beautiful, and they would bring a dowry. Is that how it works? I'm not quite sure, but I think they were certainly seen as an economic asset, and so the fact that they were a blessing wasn't merely a spiritual um, value. There was also a material value to having children, which is very much the opposite of today's situation, because now children are a huge expense and a burden on families. Um, I I have only one child, and it almost broke the bank for me uh, to contribute as far as I could to secondary education, which continued for a long time actually, to get a high level of qualification up to postgraduate level. And as a translator, I was struggling. I mean, I managed, I think, but if I'd had two children, I would have been absolutely out of my depth on my salary. So yes, children are a huge expense, and then of course there's the problem of family relationships, because we don't have stable couples and so on and so forth, and one can end up separated, as occurred to me, and then men can find themselves being responsible for childcare expenses, and it can be really just be absolutely crippling for them. um, Women, I think, are persuaded, men and women both are persuaded greatly by um, the modern narrative of overpopulation and climate change, and anthropogenic global warming, and all sorts of other scenarios that really we don't need any more people. There's the movement of the pantheists often would consider people to be more of a curse than a blessing upon the land. And to some extent, we can see it, because what's happened in my country, in England, the population has increased precipitously, mainly due to immigration, unrestricted immigration. And the countryside, the rural areas, have become depopulated. I think this is true throughout Europe, and maybe in America also, and other parts of the world. A general move to depopulate rural areas and concentrate people in the city. So we end up with these very busy and very crowded, chaotic cities, and vast areas of the country become fairly depopulated, and that increases our impression of overcrowding. But I'm very unconvinced that of this narrative of overpopulation. I think this is just scaremongering. I don't think anybody actually knows how many people are in the world anyway. I mean, this is assuming that a census has any reliable data. I'm a little bit dubious that you know census data can be considered in any way. But the world is vast as well. We have no, when you look at the size of a country like Africa, it's just boggles the mind. Living in Britain, there are many parts of Britain that do seem quite crowded. But even here, if you go out to, moorland areas and wild areas, there's just going to be acres and acres and acres of empty land, as there was in Italy. Abandoned villages up in the mountains, very, very depopulated indeed. But that's something else that's used, I think, to persuade people that we don't need any more children, we don't need any more people. People are seen as being, a negative influence, polluting and just existing, really. And I think that's understandable. It's nice to have people around, but it's not nice when it becomes so crowded. That you can't get anywhere. The roads are blocked. The beaches are inaccessible. And it just takes a lot of the fun out of everything. And when I was growing up in the 1960s, we used to go to the beach and there'd be just 2 or 3 cars, a handful of people. And it was beautiful. So it's been all my life, really. In Italy, we were able to go to some very splendid and not particularly crowded spots, and it was nice. But I think it's becoming more and more difficult to find it as people have become wealthier, and more people have cars and so on and so forth. So yeah, there's a perception of overcrowding, certainly, that contributes to the idea that having children isn't a helpful thing. And of course, all the problems of raising children. Parents now, we are seen as custodians, but the children are de facto owned by the state. You're very limited in the things that your interaction with your children is regulated by law, by a series of laws which you may or may not agree with. I mean, some of them are anti-biblical, of course. And then the interaction with the school and the children have to be molded in a certain way, and if you're going to oppose that molding, then you have to be available for homeschooling, but then you're doing that in a vacuum. And of course children do need socialization. In a proper society, they would be with their peers, and school does offer that opportunity, and it's good from that point of view, but it's generally bad from the sort of nonsense that is being taught. So all these considerations, you have to think of all this stuff. And yes, frankly, I do understand the child-free perspective. It makes sense at the moment. Now, should we, as Christians, should we there just ignore all that and follow the biblical instructions to have a full quiver and a large family and so on and so forth? I don't know. I just can't answer the question. The world seems to have changed quite a lot, and I wish it hadn't. But such is life. I suppose it's going to go forward, and there will be another change, and then we'll see some development in this area. But it's a pity because, of course, what is happening now is that sometimes the most thinking people, as it were, those who are more alert and are prepared to really meditate upon these things. So the sort of people that perhaps from a genetic point of view, you would want them to reproduce because it will be populating the world with thinking people, people who are going to be sensitive to all sorts of issues, are being dissuaded from reproducing, so their genes are dying out, and reproduction is perhaps being carried out by less conscientious people. I think that has been suggested. I mean, people who just live by the day, as it were, and reproduce without a deep sense of responsibility. And in this country, allowing the state to take on the burden of their offspring, which actually makes perfect sense, as long as you're sufficiently poor, and outside of the middle class system, as it were. You can have as many children as you want to, as long as your partners will get benefits. As long as you don't try and stay with the woman and just move from one woman to the next one, the children will be taken up by the state and paid for. Are those the sorts of genes? Is that something that's transmitted genetically anyway? These are, I could hardly, I think there's some evidence for it, but whether it's a closed case, I doubt it indeed. But we live in a very complicated world, don't we? So, my gut reaction to the child-free movement was horror, and my more meditated reaction to it is, yeah, I do see where you're coming from, and it is a logical choice at the moment. I think it, of course, people will say, well, that we're just living in an egotistical society. People are just focused on their own needs and wants and feelings and all the rest of it, all these criticisms. People are what they are, aren't they? We have to make the most of the society that we're living in at present. Biblical belief is not particularly widespread. Anyway, if we can find the answer to this question in the Bible. So the trouble with finding the answer in the Bible, there are answers in the Bible, but the Bible can't really predict the society that we're living in now, can it? And that does have an influence on how we live our lives. I'm not sure about this. This is quite an interesting question, isn't it? To what extent do we... I mean, as a religious zealot, I would say probably with most people, believers, absolutely not. The Bible holds sway whatever the situation is around us, whether we're in a raging seas or tossed in storms and under great oppression by our governments and so on and so forth. But is that realistic to say that? The costs of childcare are very real. If you just have an ordinary wage and you start bringing a lot of children into the world, and of course also you need a partner who is on the same page as a man. If your wife is a godly woman and pleased to be a wife and a mother, and is capable of again, she's in a world where she will need to have contact with other women. So, you know, people would not want to live outside of society, would they? I understand that we don't live in a vacuum, do we? We live in a society, and we have to relate to the other members of the society in one way or another. I don't know. There are questions that I'm finding it. I'm struggling to answer in many areas of my life at the moment. And one of them in particular, of course, is the church. I believe the Bible. I've come to believe the Bible, but the church doesn't seem to very much. So there's not very much solace from that quarter. As a man, living alone, separated from my wife, and so on and so forth, and all these sort of tragedies that occur. I do have to take my own personal living situation into account. It would be incautious not to consider such things. As a diligent housekeeper, as it were. I don't know. I'd be interested. This is the sort of discussion that I'd like to have with other Christians if I ever have the opportunity. God bless.